In 2012, this invisible switch just, it flipped around the globe. And I don't mean that metaphorically at all.
Right. No, it was very real.
Yeah, in the span of just a few short years, emergency room visits for self-harm among young girls nearly tripled.
Triple, just skyrocketed.
Exactly. Depression rates went through the roof. It was this sudden, synchronized wave of intense psychological suffering that just swept across adolescence everywhere.
Everywhere. All at once.
Right, not just one city or, one demographic. It wasn't a virus. It wasn't some sudden economic collapse.
No, it was something far more insidious.
Yeah, something that completely rewired human childhood. So, welcome to the deep dive.
It's a phenomenon that we all sort of sense humming in the background of modern life, I think.
Oh, absolutely.
But seeing the actual architecture of what happened, the data, it's just staggering.
It really is. And that is exactly what we are doing today. If you're listening right now and you are the classic person we affectionately call the learner.
The one who wants the hard data.
Right. The one who doesn't just want the panicked headlines, but wants the root causes, the historical context. Well, you are in the exact right place.
Absolutely.
We're unpacking this massive international investigation from a text called The Surge of Suffering, specifically looking at chapters 1 and 2. We are going to figure out what caused this plunge in mental health that seemingly began out of absolutely nowhere in the early 2010s.
Yeah, and we'll look at the undeniable data and actively debunk those popular counter theories.
Like the idea that kids are just, stressed about the economy.
Right, and it's so crucial to establish right up front, this isn't simply a moral panic.
Right, we're not just yelling at clouds here.
Exactly. We aren't here to do a generic finger-wagging lecture about how, kids these days are on their screens too much. We've all heard that.
Totally. This is a rigorous, data-driven autopsy of a fundamental transformation in human consciousness. We're looking at the exact moment society transitioned from a play-based childhood to a fine-based childhood.
And the stakes of that transition are literal life and death.
They really are. But a skeptic might say, look, numbers on a chart are sterile. You can manipulate data to tell whatever story you want.
Which is a fair point.
It is. So before we get to the macro data, and trust me, we are going to get incredibly deep into the international graphs and the hospital records later, I think we need to start on the ground.
I agree. We need to look at what this crisis actually feels like inside a single living room right now.
Exactly.
Which is exactly where the research begins. It identifies this prevailing atmosphere in modern homes as the constant conflict story.
Oh, man, the constant conflict.
Yeah. If you are a parent raising a teenager right now, or even if you just observe families in public, you know exactly what this looks like.
Family life is just completely dominated by this grueling, never-ending negotiation over technology.
It's the daily friction.
Yeah, I was reading through these firsthand accounts from parents, and the sheer exhaustion just leaps off the page. They try to lay down rules,
Right, they try to enforce screen time limits.
But there's just so many devices now. There's the phone, the tablet, the laptop for school, the gaming console, the smartwatch. It's like a hydra.
It really is. And the kids always have a structurally valid argument for why the rule needs to be bent.
Oh, always. I need my phone because my study group is on iMessage.
I need Discord because the team coordinates there.
Exactly. Parents describe this overwhelming sensation of resisting an ever-rising tide.
They're just trying to maintain basic, traditional human connection, like just eating dinner together.
Or having a normal conversation in the car. But it feels like trying to hold back the ocean with a broom. They just feel completely engulfed.
And for a lot of these parents, there isn't necessarily a severe clinical diagnosis attached to their child. It's just this underlying gnawing grief.
This sense that something deeply unnatural is happening.
Right, that their kids are missing out on the physical world while thousands of online hours just quietly stack up. But the investigation also highlights cases where that daily friction boils over into absolute crisis. Like this one specific case study of a 14-year-old girl from Boston named Emily.
Yeah, Emily's story perfectly encapsulates the terrifying depth of this issue. Her parents were attentive. They could see very clearly the damage that her constant use of Instagram was doing to her.
Her mood was plummeting. Her anxiety was spiking.
So like any responsible parents, they intervened. They used software to monitor and limit the apps on her phone.
But it didn't solve the problem at all.
No, it escalated into a hostage situation.
Literally. Emily actually hacked her way around her parents' firewalls.
Wait, really? A 14-year-old?
Yes. In this one incredibly distressing episode, she managed to get into her mother's phone, completely disabled the monitoring software, and then issued this devastating ultimatum.
What did she say?
She threatened to kill herself if her parents ever reinstalled it.
Oh my God.
Yeah. Just pause and think about the psychological state of a 14-year-old in that moment. The sheer desperation.
That's not a child throwing a tantrum over a toy.
Not at all. It mimics the behavioral patterns of profound addiction, or someone terrified of losing their primary life support system.
Wow.
Her mother literally noted that it felt like the only way to actually remove the smartphone from Emily's life was to physically uproot the family and move to a deserted island.
But here's the critical data point in Emily's story. It's the reason we aren't just telling a sad story of a hopelessly lost child. Her mother observed 2 accidental but highly revealing experiments.
Right. Emily went away to a specific summer camp for 6 weeks.
And absolutely no phones or electronics were permitted. A hard ban.
And her mother reported that whenever they picked Emily up from this camp, she was just her normal self.
The anxiety was gone, the hostility was gone, she was just a regular 14-year-old girl again.
But the literal second she was handed her smartphone back for the car ride home, the agitation and the dark glumness came rushing back.
It's an immediate, observable reversion to baseline.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And they saw the exact same result during a different period when they confiscated her smartphone for 2 months.
Oh, right. They gave her a basic flip phone.
Yeah, just a stripped-down flip phone. Calls and texts, no social web. And again, she returned to her normal, healthy self.
The environmental toxin was removed, and the symptoms vanished.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And the researchers made a very clear point that this isn't just about girls and social media.
Right. The mechanisms of capture are different for boys, but the results are strikingly similar.
For boys, the stories usually revolve around immersive video games, online communities, and pornography, rather than selfie-based platforms.
So let's talk about the case of James, another 14-year-old.
James is a fascinating case because of the compounding variables. He has mild autism.
But the research notes he was actually thriving right up until 2020.
Yes, making great progress in school, heavily involved in judo, had physical outlets.
But then the COVID lockdowns hit.
School shut down. His physical routines were vaporized overnight. He was 11 at the time.
And his parents, like millions of other parents, suddenly trapped inside balancing work and childcare, just needed to find something for him to do.
So they bought him a PlayStation.
Which, I mean, in the short term, seemed like a massive win. He enjoyed the games, and it provided a channel for social connection when physical socializing was illegal.
But then the nature of the engagement shifted. He transitioned from playing casually to becoming a heavy gamer.
Specifically playing Fortnite for longer and longer uninterrupted stretches.
And Fortnite isn't just a game you play and put down.
Right, it's an endless social ecosystem, a place to hang out.
Exactly. But his father noted that as the hours increased, the psychological shift happened. The depression set in.
The anger, the lethargy. He started snapping viciously at his parents.
So James's parents tried to pull the same lever Emily's parents did. They took all the electronics away to reset his behavior.
But the result was literal withdrawal.
Yes, that is the exact clinical term used in the text. James exhibited profound withdrawal symptoms.
Intense irritability, physical aggressiveness, refusing to come out of his room.
His nervous system was in absolute shock from the sudden absence of that hyper-stimulating digital environment.
Now, obviously, those acute withdrawal symptoms began to subside after a few days, but his parents were left staring down an impossible dilemma.
And the father said a quote that is just, it's heartbreaking.
He said, "We tried to limit his use, but he doesn't have any friends other than those he communicates with online, so how much can we cut him off?"
That is the crux of the entire modern parenting crisis.
Right. But I have to push back here, or at least play devil's advocate for the learner listening who might be a bit skeptical.
Sure, go for it.
Because every single generation complains about the next generation's culture. I mean, in the 1950s, parents thought rock and roll was going to destroy the moral fabric of youth.
Right, the rock and roll panic.
In the 80s, you had the satanic panic over Dungeons and Dragons. In the 90s, parents swore that watching MTV or playing Doom was rotting our brains. So isn't this just the modern 21st century iteration of that exact same parental panic? The kids are using a new toy. We don't understand it, so it must be evil.
It is a completely necessary question. Any rigorous investigation has to confront that historical bias.
Right. It's totally natural to assume this is just the turning of the generational wheel.
But the underlying mechanics of this shift, prove that this is fundamentally different from television or comic books.
How so?
What separates this is the shared feeling among parents of being truly trapped and structurally powerless.
But why are they powerless? I mean, my parents didn't feel powerless when they marched into the living room and physically unplugged my Nintendo. They just did it, and I got mad, and then I went outside.
Because turning off your Nintendo in 1996 didn't sever your only tie to your entire peer group.
Oh, wow.
Right, when you went outside, your friends are also outside.
That's true.
The research highlights this ultimate catch-22, which it calls the parent trap. The vast majority of parents do not want a phone-based childhood for your kids. They see the anxiety, the sleep deprivation.
But the world has completely reconfigured itself around these devices.
Exactly. If a parent resists today, if they confiscate the smartphone or permanently remove the console, they aren't just taking away a toy or a piece of entertainment.
They are condemning their child to total social isolation.
Yes. The child's entire social infrastructure, how they know where people are hanging out, the inside jokes, maintaining status, it all exists exclusively inside that device now.
That simply wasn't true of comic books or Dungeons and Dragons.
Not at all.
Okay, that is a chilling distinction. If you take the phone, you take the social world, the world has reconfigured itself.
Yeah.
But look, Emily and James are powerful stories. That parental trap is viscerally relatable. But as a data nerd, I know that two compelling anecdotes do not equal a generational synchronized crisis. We can't build an entire sociological framework just on the friction happening in a few households.
No, we need objective data.
Right. If Emily and James's reactions are truly biological responses to this tech and not just isolated behavioral issues, we should see it mirrored on a national scale.
Absolutely. We need to zoom out and look at the hard numbers.
So let's look at the data. We need to focus our lens on a very precise window of time, right?
Yes. The years between 2010 and 2015.
The researchers map out this timeline, and the first thing that jumps off the page is the baseline.
The 2000s.
Yeah, throughout the entire decade of the 2000s, from 2000 up to about 2009, there was basically zero sign of an impending mental illness crisis among adolescents.
Right. The lines on the tracking charts are relatively flat. Some minor fluctuations, but mostly stable.
The teens coming of age in the late 90s and 2000s, the bulk of the millennial generation, were actually doing quite well psychologically.
They were. But then, right around the early 2010s, something massive happened. This is the period identified as the Great Rewiring.
And the data backing this up comes from massive, highly respected sources like the U.S. National Survey on Drug Use and Health,
which rigorously tracks mental health through extensive interviews with teens.
Right. They ask deeply specific questions. Things like, have you had periods lasting longer than 2 weeks where you felt sad, empty, or depressed most of the day?
Have you lost interest in almost all things you usually enjoy?
Have you experienced changes in sleep or appetite? If a teen answers yes to enough of these, they are classified as having suffered a major depressive episode in the past year.
And when researchers plot that data for teens aged 12 to 17, the resulting line graph is absolutely staggering.
It forms a distinct, undeniable hockey stick shape starting exactly around 2012.
It's flat, flat, flat throughout the 2000s, and then suddenly the line violently shoots almost straight upward.
The specific percentages are hard to even wrap your head around. Since 2010, the rate of major depressive episodes increased by 145% for teenage girls.
145%. That's a relative increase.
Let me say that again. Yeah, 145%. And for boys, it increased by 161%.
That means clinical depression became roughly 2.5 times more prevalent in the span of just a few years.
It didn't discriminate. It happened across all racial demographics, all geographic regions, all socioeconomic classes.
And the data notes that by 2020, and this is crucial, this was mostly before the COVID lockdowns even took full effect, 1 in 4 American teen girls had experienced a major depressive episode in the previous year.
1 in 4.
It is an entirely unprecedented surge in the history of modern psychological tracking.
But to truly understand what is happening inside the minds of these kids, we have to precisely define the exact nature of this suffering.
Because mental illness is a broad umbrella, what exactly are they suffering from?
The data reveals that this surge is overwhelmingly concentrated in what psychiatry categorizes as internalizing disorders.
Right, as opposed to externalizing disorders.
I think we need to break that distinction down for the learner listening, because understanding how the suffering manifests is the key to understanding what caused it.
It is the absolute core of the mystery. Externalizing disorders occur when a person feels intense psychological distress and turns those symptoms outward.
Projecting them onto other people or the physical environment?
Yes. This looks like conduct disorder, severe difficulty managing anger, physical violence, destruction of property.
Or excessive risk-taking, like drunk driving or fighting.
But the data shows that's not what's spiking.
In fact, aren't kids today physically safer and better behaved in terms of risk-taking than teenagers in the 80s or 90s?
Exactly. Both sexes have actually been experiencing a steady decline in externalizing disorders since the early 2010s.
Juvenile crime is down, teen pregnancy is down, underage drinking is down. Kids are not acting out physically.
What is ballooning at terrifying rates are the internalizing disorders.
Where the distress collapses inward.
Yes. The symptoms are internalized. Severe anxiety, paralyzing fear, profound sadness, hopelessness. The individual ruminates endlessly. They withdraw from physical social engagement. They become trapped inside their own minds.
Okay, let me try an analogy here to see if I'm grasping the functional difference, specifically when it comes to anxiety, which really seems to be the defining illness here.
Sure.
When I think about fear versus anxiety, fear is like jumping out of the way of an oncoming speeding car before your brain even fully processes the vehicle, right?
Yes, it's a primitive survival alarm.
The alarm rings, your muscles react, you jump to safety, the car passes, and the alarm immediately turns off.
Exactly. That is the amygdala firing. It's a lightning-fast, highly efficient response system that mammals evolved over millions of years to survive physical predators.
But anxiety feels totally different.
How so?
Anxiety is sitting perfectly safely in your own quiet bedroom, physical needs met, no predators in sight, but your internal alarm bell is stuck on a hair trigger.
Wow, yeah.
It's constantly ringing, flooding your nervous system with cortisol and adrenaline, warning you about a metaphorical car that might exist tomorrow or next week, or in a theoretical text message you haven't received yet.
There is zero immediate physical danger, but the alarm absolutely will not stop.
Right.
That is a phenomenal analogy. And the research dives deeply into the evolutionary perspective to explain exactly why this happens.
Oh, okay.
It points out that it is entirely healthy and necessary to be anxious when there's real danger lurking. But when that primitive alarm system is continuously activated by ordinary non-lethal events, temporary anxiety metastasizes into a chronic anxiety disorder.
The system burns out.
Exactly.
But here's the million-dollar question. Why are modern teenagers' biological alarms stuck in the on position while they're just sitting safely in their bedroom staring at a piece of glass?
We have to look at what that alarm system evolved to detect.
Yeah.
What's deeply fascinating here is that while mammals evolved this system for physical threats, humans are unique.
Because of our social nature?
Yes. Our supreme evolutionary advantage relies entirely on our large brains and our immense capacity to form complex, cooperative social groups. So we evolved this exact same biological alarm system to respond to social threats.
Wait, really? The brain uses the exact same hardware for a lion attack and a social slight?
Yes. For early humans, being shunned, exiled, or shamed by the tribe historically meant literal death. You could not survive the harsh environment alone.
Oh, wow.
So for an adolescent whose brain is already inherently wired by puberty to care intensely about peer integration and social status, the threat of being shunned, what sociologists call social death, is processed by the brain's alarm system with the exact same intensity as the threat of physical death.
So when a 13-year-old girl is looking at Instagram and she sees all her friends at a party she wasn't invited to, her brain isn't just processing sadness.
No.
Her brain is screaming that she's been exiled from the tribe and is going to die.
Precisely. She is dodging social annihilation every time she refreshes the feed.
That is terrifying.
The alarm is constantly ringing because the digital environment provides a nonstop stream of social threat data. And this intense, unrelenting anxiety leads directly into the second most common internalizing disorder, depression, specifically major depressive disorder.
Right, MDD.
And the clinical definition of MDD isn't just feeling very sad. It is a profound, total loss of interest or pleasure in all activities. It's a flattening of human experience.
The researchers actually quote Hamlet here to describe it, which I think captures the clinical reality beautifully. How weary, stale, flat, and unprofitable seem to me all the uses of this world.
That's a devastating quote.
But it perfectly describes that absolute draining of color and meaning from the world. You just stop caring.
And if we connect this to the mechanics of internalizing disorders, we see a terrifying vicious cycle take hold. People are highly likely to become depressed when they feel socially disconnected or threatened.
Right.
But then, the depression itself drains their energy, making them withdraw further into their bedrooms, making them infinitely less interested in seeking out the very physical social connections that could actually heal them.
It's an inward, self-perpetuating spiral.
Yeah.
Okay, I hear all of this. I understand the evolutionary mismatch. I see the hockey stick graphs on the self-reported surveys. But let me step in and play the role of the ultimate skeptic again.
Bring it on.
Because I distinctly remember back in 2018, right when researchers were first starting to sound the alarm on this, there was a major, highly circulated essay in the New York Times titled "The Big Myth About Teenage Anxiety."
I remember that piece well.
And the argument there, and from a lot of cultural commentators at the time, was basically, look, maybe there isn't a massive crisis at all. Maybe Gen Z is just way more comfortable talking about their feelings than Gen X or boomers were.
May have a vocabulary of therapy now.
Exactly. Maybe they are just overdiagnosing normal teenage angst on these surveys because mental health is destigmatized. So how do we know this entire crisis isn't just a change in cultural vocabulary?
It's a very fair point. Right.
If a kid knows the word gaslighting or toxic, they might check yes on a survey, but it doesn't mean they're clinically ill. We need objective behavioral proof to validate these subjective surveys.
And the investigators completely agree with that skepticism. It is a scientifically necessary hurdle. If the suffering is real, if it's not just a linguistic trend, it will undeniably show up in behaviors, not just in self-reported survey answers.
You cannot just look at what teens say. You have to look at what teens do.
Exactly. So researchers turned to the most objective medical data available. They looked at CDC hospital records.
Specifically, emergency room admissions.
Yes, because you can't fake an ER visit.
Right. A teenager doesn't end up in the emergency room getting stitches just because they learned a new therapy word on TikTok.
No, they don't. The researchers looked at hospital admissions for non-fatal self-injury, which the medical community refers to as NSSI.
This often involves behaviors like cutting or burning the skin.
Yes, without the explicit intent to die. It is usually utilized as a desperate physical coping mechanism to release debilitating, built-up psychological anxiety.
And alongside NSSI, they looked at actual documented suicide attempts. And what did the CDC data show? Did the hard behavioral data match the self-reported survey hockey stick?
It matched it terrifyingly well. The data completely demolishes the "they're just talking about it more" myth. Let's look at the numbers for young adolescent girls, specifically ages 10 to 14.
Okay.
The rate of self-harm severe enough to require emergency room treatment nearly tripled from 2010 to 2020.
Tripled.
That is an 188% increase.
For girls between 10 and 14 years old, children who are barely out of elementary school.
Yes, and the suicide rates follow the exact same grim trajectory. Suicide rates for young girls aged 10 to 14 increased by 167% since 2010.
God, that is horrible.
It really is.
Yeah.
Now, the research makes a careful point to note that while completed suicide rates are historically and generally higher for boys across all Western nations, largely due to the methods chosen,
Right.
the rates of attempted suicides and non-suicidal self-harm are vastly higher for girls. It acts as this desperate, heartbreaking release valve for the paralyzing internal anxiety we just discussed.
So the behavioral proof is absolute. The crisis is real, it is physical, and it is deadly.
Yes.
But I want to zero in on the specific demographic you just highlighted because I think it's the key to the whole mystery. Why preteen and young teen girls specifically?
Girls aged 10 to 14.
Right. What exactly changed in their highly specific universe around 2010 to 2012 that caused emergency room visits for self-harm to triple almost overnight?
That is the pivotal world-shifting question. The researchers call this specific demographic clue the undeniable fact that preteen girls got hit the absolute hardest, fastest, and earliest, the smoking gun of the entire investigation.
It acts as a massive filter.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It forces us to look for an environmental change that disproportionately affected the social dynamics and peer lives of 10 to 14-year-old girls exactly in the early 2010s.
Which perfectly tees up our prime suspect. We've proven the crisis is real. We know exactly when the bomb went off, so we have to talk about the technology that was suddenly placed in their pockets.
The Great Rewiring.
To truly understand the Great Rewiring, the analysis insists we have to differentiate between the two waves of the internet. Because a very common pushback is, well, the internet has been around since the mid-90s. I grew up with dial-up. Why didn't millennials lose their minds?
Right. I grew up with an AOL email address and dial-up towns, and my generation survived just fine.
Exactly. The first wave of the internet in the 1990s and early 2000s was defined by personal desktop computers and dial-up connections.
And the analysis points out that this wave did not harm teen mental health. Millennials grew up on this first wave and were actually slightly happier on average than Gen X had been.
And the reason is physical. The computer was stationary.
Right. It was usually in the family room. You sat down, you used it for a specific task. Maybe you went to a specific website or chatted on AIM for an hour, and then you physically walked away from it.
You logged off. Somebody else in the house needed to use the phone line.
You had an away message. You could leave the internet behind.
Exactly. It was a destination, not an environment.
But the second wave was fundamentally different in its architecture. The second wave was the paired technologies of the smartphone and algorithmic social media.
Let's look at the rapid adoption statistics.
In 2011, according to Pew Research, only 23% of American teens had a smartphone.
The vast majority still had basic flip phones and had to use a stationary family computer to access Facebook.
But by 2016, just 5 years later, 79% of teens owned a smartphone.
So in a tiny 5-year window, it went from a luxury item for a quarter of kids to a ubiquitous mandatory appendage for basically everyone.
Yes, and with the device permanently in their pocket, the time spent online exploded. In 2015, surveys showed 25% of teens were online almost constantly.
And by 2022?
That number was 46%. Nearly half of all teenagers online continuously from the moment they wake up until they fall asleep.
Okay, but let's go back to that smoking gun window. 2010 to 2012, we know that's when the hospital visits tripled for young girls. What specific technological innovations dropped right then that pulled the trigger?
The crucial turning points are perfectly aligned in the tech timeline. In June 2010, Apple introduced the iPhone 4.
Why does that specific model matter?
It was the very first iPhone, equipped with a front-facing camera. Suddenly, it was incredibly easy and intuitive to take high-quality photos and videos of yourself.
The birth of selfie culture.
Yes. And that very same year, 2010, an app launched that was built entirely around sharing those photos from smartphones, Instagram.
The delivery mechanism.
Precisely. And then in 2012, Facebook bought Instagram. Its user base exploded from around 10 million users in late 2011 to 90 million by early 2013.
Creating the modern, inescapable smartphone and selfie-based social media ecosystem.
And this explains the demographic clue.
Yep.
This explains why 10 to 14-year-old girls were the ones whose ER visits tripled.
Right, because of how they used it.
It's exactly. The investigation deeply breaks down the gender divide and how this new tech was utilized. Girls, who are developmentally wired to care deeply about social dynamics and inclusion, move their entire social lives onto these highly visual, heavily curated platforms like Instagram.
Eventually, they gained access to apps like Facetune to literally alter their physical appearance in real time.
Which led to a continuous 247 cycle of brutal social comparison. The metrics of popularity, likes, followers, comments, became public, numerical values attached to a young girl's identity.
As researchers note, whether a girl used digital filters or not, the physical reflection she saw in the bathroom mirror got less and less attractive relative to the highly edited, perfectly lit, curated girl she saw every single time she looked at her phone.
It's an unwinnable, relentless beauty pageant happening in your pocket every minute of the day. You can't ever look away.
And what were the boys doing during this exact same time period?
Boys retreated from the physical world, but they burrowed deeper into the virtual world through different avenues.
Yeah.
They engaged intensely with immersive online multiplayer games, massive communities like Reddit, infinite algorithmic loops on YouTube, and the research explicitly notes the sudden, frictionless availability of hardcore pornography.
All of which became accessible anytime, anywhere, for free, right on the supercomputer in their pockets.
Right. They weren't performing for the camera as much. They were seeking infinite virtual stimulation.
So the entire generation essentially evacuated the physical world.
Yeah.
I was struck by a quote from the research that really crystallized this for me.
Which one?
It said, "It's as though we sent Gen Z to grow up on Mars."
Wow. Yeah.
We basically performed the largest, most pervasive, uncontrolled psychological experiment in human history on our own children, completely blind to the fact that the atmosphere was toxic until the ER data started coming back years later.
That's a profound and terrifying way to frame it.
Ugh.
To elaborate on that Mars analogy, the analysis brings in the work of Sherry Turkle, a brilliant professor at MIT who has studied our relationship with technology for decades.
Yeah.
She coined a phrase back in 2015 to describe the reality of life with smartphones. She said, "We are forever elsewhere."
Forever elsewhere, meaning even if a teenager is physically sitting right in front of you at the dinner table or sitting at a desk in a classroom or hanging out on a couch with their friends, their consciousness is split.
Exactly. They aren't really in the room. A substantial, active portion of their attention is continuously monitoring the social metaverse for threats or rewards.
They're existing in a state of continuous partial attention.
And the analysis makes a vital, often overlooked point here. This changed the reality of social life for everyone, even the kids who didn't have phones.
Wait, unpack that for me. Because a lot of parents think, well, if I just hold out, if I don't give my kid a smartphone until they're 16, they'll be safe from all this. Are you saying they aren't?
They are not safe.
Yeah.
Because their peers lost the ability to be fully present.
Mm.
Think about it. Even if you are the one resilient kid without a phone, you are now trying to interact with a peer group that is forever elsewhere. You go to a party, and everyone is staring at their laps.
Right.
Try to have a conversation, and the person keeps glancing at a glowing screen. The entire local social ecosystem collapsed.
Normal adolescent sleep patterns were destroyed because the phone was in the bed. Physical, unstructured activity plummeted.
This fundamental recasting of how childhood actually functions over just 5 years is why it's not just a story about a new gadget. It is the great rewiring.
Okay, this argument is incredibly robust. The timing lines up perfectly with the introduction of the front-facing camera.
Yes.
The mechanics of the algorithmic technology perfectly explain the specific psychological symptoms of internalizing disorders.
Exactly.
But as amateur detectives, we know we can't just lock on to our very first suspect without rigorously stress testing it against all other possibilities. We are placing the blame squarely on the iPhone and Instagram, but we have to look at the massive global events happening around these kids in the early 2010s. We have to address the state of the world rebuttal.
This is a crucial, intellectually honest step. When researchers present this data, they frequently get intense pushback.
Critics will say, of course Gen Z is depressed. Look at the state of the world we handed them.
They're growing up with the existential dread of climate change. They lived through the aftermath of the 2008 global financial crisis. They're watching extreme political polarization. They have active shooter drills in their schools.
Right. It's the physical world that's depressing them, not the phone.
It sounds like a highly rational, intuitive argument.
So how does the investigation test the smartphone hypothesis against these alternative environmental theories? Let's start with the economy. The generation disaster theory, which points to the 2008 global financial crash, the housing crisis, and the crushing weight of rising student debt.
The analysis refutes the economic theory purely by looking at the timeline. If the devastating 2008 financial crash was the primary cause of this specific mental health crisis, then the millennial generation, who were actively entering the job market, trying to buy houses, and trying to start lives right as the economy violently collapsed, they should have suffered the massive mental health plunge.
But they didn't. Their mental health remained relatively stable.
Furthermore, if you track adolescent depression alongside the U.S. unemployment rate, the lines actually go in complete opposite directions.
I was looking at those charts, and the divergence is wild.
It's completely inverse. U.S. unemployment spiked massively in 2008 and 2009. But then, from 2010 all the way to 2019, unemployment fell continuously, eventually hitting historic, decades-long lows.
The economy was recovering, jobs were coming back, the stock market was booming.
Yet, adolescent depression rose steadily and aggressively during that exact same 10-year period of sustained economic recovery.
Plus, it's incredibly difficult to logically explain why an economic crisis regarding mortgages and jobs would inexplicably hit 11-year-old girls harder and faster than 30-year-old adults losing their careers.
That makes perfect logical sense. The economic timeline completely fails to match the behavioral data.
Okay, what about the big existential threats? Climate change. The feeling of impending doom. Kids are constantly told the world is physically ending. Doesn't that cause massive generational anxiety?
The investigation handles this very carefully. Just to be clear, the source material maintains strict neutrality on the politics of the issues themselves, but focuses heavily on historical psychological data.
Right.
And the researchers point out a fascinating truth. Impending threats to a nation or generation historically do not cause widespread rates of mental illness to rise.
That sounds completely counterintuitive. If you think the world is ending, shouldn't you be depressed?
It seems like you should, but look at the psychological history of the 20th century. When countries face massive, terrifying collective threats like the outbreak of World War II, or the Blitz in London, or sudden terrorism like 9/11, suicide rates and depression rates usually drop.
They drop? Wait, really?
Yes, because people rally around the flag and around each other. They are infused with a strong, urgent sense of collective purpose. They have a shared mission.
Wow.
The analysis notes that practically every generation has grown up under the shadow of terrifying existential threats. The greatest generation had the Great Depression and World War II, Boomers and Gen X had the very real daily threat of instant nuclear annihilation during the Cold War, hiding under desks and drills. They had the Vietnam draft.
So why didn't those previous generations see a 150% spike in clinical depression?
Because human beings don't typically get depressed when they face collective threats together. They get depressed when they feel isolated, lonely, and fundamentally useless.
Ah.
Activism in the past, like the massive anti-Vietnam protests in the 1960s or the early environmental activism in the 1970s, energized young people because it was inherently physical and in-person. It was communal. They were physically marching together, building solidarity.
But modern psychological studies show that today's virtual activism, reposting infographics on Instagram, doom-scrolling Twitter, is actually strongly correlated with worse mental health.
It doesn't build community, it just builds individual despair.
But I have to push back hard on one specific point regarding the state of the world.
Sure.
We are talking about the exact year 2012, which is when the hockey stick curve violently shoots up. That was the year of the Sandy Hook Elementary School shooting.
Yes, it was.
You cannot tell me that an event that uniquely horrific, involving the murder of children in a place that is supposed to be safe, didn't shatter the psyche of an entire generation of kids and make them feel fundamentally unsafe.
It is an incredibly dark, deeply tragic event. And the researchers absolutely do not minimize the horror of that reality.
Right.
But to analyze it scientifically, we have to look closely at the mechanism of delivery.
What do you mean?
The critical difference isn't that the world suddenly started generating unspeakable tragedies in 2012. Horrific tragedies, violence, and school traumas have sadly always existed in various forms.
Sure.
The fundamental difference is that for the first time in human history, the world's most agonizing tragedies were being pumped directly and continuously into adolescents' developing brains through the supercomputers in their pockets.
It's not just the event, it's how they experience the event. They weren't watching Walter Cronkite deliver the news at 6 p.m. while sitting on the couch next to their parents.
Exactly. They were experiencing it as highly contagious, algorithmically amplified, emotion-driven social media content. The social media algorithms are explicitly designed to reward emotional extremes and outrage to keep users engaged.
So young people were suddenly consuming the totality of the world's trauma while physically isolated in their bedrooms.
Surrounded not by comforting adults, but by the amplified, contagious, spiraling distress of millions of anonymous peers on these networks. The threat wasn't binding them together in a physical community to mourn and heal. The digital delivery of the threat was isolating them in a state of permanent, paralyzed panic.
Okay, so the delivery system is the poison, not just the news itself. And if that's true, if the cause was specifically the U.S. economy or U.S. political polarization or U.S.-specific tragedies like school shootings, then we shouldn't see this exact same mental health plunge in other countries that didn't experience those specific American events.
Exactly. That is the exact scientific control group we need. And this is the final decisive nail in the coffin for those alternative environment-based theories.
Okay.
The investigation takes us on a data-driven trip around the globe to look at the international trends. This is what finally, irrefutably locks in the smartphone and algorithmic social media hypothesis as the only globally consistent variable capable of explaining the data.
Okay, let's take that international trip. Where does the data lead us first?
Let's start right next door, in Canada.
Okay.
Canada is culturally very similar to the U.S., so it's a great baseline comparison. But crucially, it lacks many of the specific features often blamed for the U.S. crisis.
Like what?
Well, Canada largely avoided the devastating worst of the 2008 financial crisis due to stricter banking regulations. They have vastly lower rates of violent crime and gun violence. They have a significantly stronger social safety net and universal health care.
So if the crisis is caused by economic anxiety or fear of physical violence, Canadian kids should be largely insulated. They should be fine.
But they absolutely aren't. Canadian women aged 15 to 30 saw a massive 29% decrease in reporting their mental health as excellent or very good, starting right in 2011.
Oh, wow.
And a crucial, highly revealing detail. The older women in Canada, those aged 47 and older who didn't grow up on smartphones, saw basically zero change in their mental health during that same period.
So it's generational, not environmental for the whole country.
Furthermore, when you look at Canadian emergency room visits for teenage self-harm, the graph mirrors the U.S. spike almost identically.
Identical timing, identical demographic hit. Okay, what about across the ocean?
The researchers looked at the United Kingdom and Australia. Both nations showed the exact same timeline. UK medical records show severe self-harm episodes for teens abruptly spiking in the early 2010s. Down in Australia, hospitalizations for acute mental health emergencies among teens and young adults surged simultaneously.
Okay, but a skeptic would point out that Canada, the UK, and Australia are all English-speaking, culturally Western nations with similar media ecosystems. What if we go somewhere totally different, like the Nordic countries? Finland, Sweden, Denmark.
Right.
They have different languages, massive, robust social safety nets, essentially free higher education, totally different political climates, and historically rank as the happiest countries on Earth. Surely they escaped this.
The author of the investigation specifically hired an independent researcher to dive into the data for Finland, Sweden, Denmark, Norway, and Iceland just to test this exact theory.
And the result?
The exact same graph. High psychological distress among Nordic teens shot straight up right after 2010. The pattern is completely indistinguishable from the English-speaking countries.
It's a complete global synchronization.
It is. And the research provides one more massive, undeniable piece of global evidence. The PISA data.
What's PISA?
PISA is a comprehensive global educational survey that tests 15-year-olds across 37 different countries on various metrics. But importantly, embedded in their academic surveys are deep psychological questions about school alienation. Students are asked to agree or disagree with statements like, I feel lonely at school, or I feel like an outsider or left out of things.
And what did the PISA data reveal about the timeline?
From the year 2000 all the way to 2012, reports of feeling lonely and friendless at school were completely flat and relatively low across the globe.
Well, then.
But then, right after 2012, those feelings of profound alienation spiked sharply across the entire Western world, in Europe, in English-speaking nations, in Latin America, everywhere.
Was it everywhere? Everywhere?
Interestingly, the investigation notes that East Asia did not see this exact same sudden spike in alienation at that exact time, which points to complex cultural differences in tech adoption, family structures, or academic pressure that researchers are still exploring.
Right.
But across the entire Western world, as soon as smartphones aggressively entered the school hallways, alienation skyrocketed.
There is such a dark, almost unbelievable irony in that PISA data.
How so?
Well, the very devices that the tech companies in Silicon Valley sold to us as the ultimate tools for connection, the magical screens that were supposed to bring the entire world together into a global village, literally created a synchronized spike in kids feeling deeply lonely, alienated and friendless, while standing shoulder to shoulder right next to each other in the school hallway.
It perfectly illustrates Turkle's concept of being forever elsewhere. If every single kid in the school hallway is looking down at a glowing screen, constantly checking to see what's happening somewhere else, no one is actually present in the hallway. The physical community dissolves.
So bringing all these threads together, the prevailing theory, based on all this data, is that no other explanation can account for this reality.
None. No other theory can explain a globally synchronized, multinational collapse in adolescent mental health that consistently hits preteen girls the hardest and universally starts exactly between 2010 and 2015.
It wasn't the American economy. It wasn't a specific, localized geopolitical event.
The only scientifically plausible theory is the rapid introduction of the smartphone, the front-facing camera, the hyperviral algorithmic social media ecosystem, and the resulting devastating loss of the play-based childhood.
It's an incredibly compelling case, and honestly, as someone who lives in this world, it's profoundly overwhelming, but it gives us clarity, right? We aren't guessing anymore.
We aren't.
Let's conceptually pull together the journey we just took. We started by looking at the sudden, inexplicable surge in anxiety and depression starting in 2012, that undeniable hockey stick curve that broke the trend line of the 2000s. We moved past the subjective surveys and looked at the hard, indisputable hospital records, the CDC data on self-harm and suicide, proving that this psychological crisis is manifesting in terrifying physical reality.
Yeah, the behavioral proof.
Then we identified the prime suspects: the front-facing camera, the rise of continuous algorithmic social media, and the fundamental tragic shift from a physically engaging play-based childhood to an isolated, phone-based childhood.
And then we rigorously stress-tested that theory. We ruled out the 2008 economy and U.S.-specific world events by looking at the identical synchronized data from Canada, the UK, Australia, and the Nordic countries.
And that comprehensive understanding leads directly into the next vital phase of this exploration, because proving what caused the damage is only half the battle.
Exactly. We now know what was introduced, but we must deeply examine what was removed. We have to look at exactly what a play-based childhood provided that was so suddenly lost.
Because to truly understand why the phone-based childhood is so uniquely destructive, we have to understand the evolutionary mechanisms of physical play, risk-taking, and face-to-face conflict resolution that were violently interrupted.
That's the real biological backstory of the Great Rewiring.
I can't wait to unpack the evolutionary biology of play in the future. But before we wrap up today, I want to leave you, the learner, with a final thought to mull over. We've thrown a massive amount of data and sociology at you, but let's connect it back to the visceral physical reality of the human body.
Yes, we discussed earlier how our brain's ancient threat detection system, the amygdala, evolved over millions of years to protect us from physical danger,
Right.
and how algorithmic social media hijacks that exact same system by weaponizing our deep-seated fear of social exile.
Mhm.
But think about the physical reality of this for a moment.
Yeah.
For the first time in human history, we have an entire generation whose physical bodies are sitting perfectly still. They are physically safe in a quiet, temperature-controlled bedroom. But internally, their nervous systems are constantly running for their lives from invisible digital predators.
They are existing in a state of permanent paralyzed flight.
What does that profound physiological disconnect? The body sitting still while the brain screams in terror due to a developing human over the course of a critical 10-year developmental window? Think about that the next time you see a quiet room full of kids staring silently at their screens. It might look peaceful on the surface, but underneath, the alarms are deafening.
The physical environment looks safer than ever, but the internal landscape is completely fractured. To the learner listening to this right now, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We hope this gave you a new lens to view the world around you. Keep questioning the narratives, keep looking for the data beneath the surface, and we will see you next time.